So 1,000 thanks for the invitation. In my daily job, I work for an organization which is called Alternative to Violence. It was the first offer for perpetrators in Europe, not for the victims of violence, but those who practice it. Briefly about the organization. It has 15 offices and the staff is 105. And we are working on 3 areas presently. The first is offer of treatment and therapy for those who practice violence, as well as support for victims and children. And we are also conducting clinical research, elaborating methods, and disseminate knowledge about the topic. The road to our center, the perpetrator is invited to contact us without any summons or referrals, but sometimes they are recommended to do this. For example, the so-called Family Welfare Office. Everyone can turn to them if they have some serious problems in the family. Often these are couples who have merely communication problems, but among them there are families with violence in them. And when the perpetrators come to us, at first we map them, we identify the kind of violence that is involved, their psychiatric health condition, their childhood, their personal history of violence. Then in a relatively short time we understand what kind of a person we are dealing with. Then we are inviting both partners for a conversation. For security reasons, we invite the partners for a conversation with us, and what we are discussing with the partners is we are trying to understand the situation, and while mapping in this mapping process we interview the partner, we find out about addictions, potential criminality, possible litigation or investigation that is ongoing. That is often a difficult time for the person. When you can expect lowered empathy, unstable living situation. Then stalking is a phenomenon which we face often. Stalking in everyday situations, as well as discontinuing of relationships, which is a crisis situation. Then also serious violence, for example, strangulation, choking the person. Then the perpetrator operates with an expanded definition of violence. Very often we assume that violence involves physical action, but we have an extended definition. And we use the definition that is used widely in Norway, namely violence is any activity turned against another person which causes pain, frightens, or offends the person. So if the person cannot stop the violence by expressing their unwillingness. And most often violence is associated with physical violence, but we are mostly working with psychological violence, and psychological violence has a very complex nature. Namely, psychological or emotional violence is often explained by the behavior of the other party. The perpetrator says, I wouldn't be doing this if you hadn't said so and so. Then there is sexual violence and all kinds of pressure. For example, in sexual relationship, the pressure to start a sexual relationship or to blackmail the person in this regard. Then there is material violence. For example, destroying of objects which are important for the other person. For example, inherited objects, some toys, some things that mean a lot to the victim. And then there is latent violence, which is discussed the least, to the least extent, and that is potential violence. Namely, the victim may be walking on their tiptoes not to be subjected to this kind of violence. The victim does everything possible, and psychologically it is highly traumatic. It is like living in a war zone psychologically. Now I will speak briefly about the psychological violence which has been discussed earlier, but we will just touch on the main points. The usual phrase is, if you don't do this, then A or B will happen. This is a way how to control the other person with threats. The person is reminded all kinds of unpleasant things. Remember what happened then. To achieve domination over the other person. It's degrading behavior, calling the person names, criticizing the person unnecessarily, doing it directly or indirectly, as well as control is another manifestation of psychological violence. Then jealousy. Jealousy and control are often linked closely. Interrogation, where you have been, stalking, tracking the communication channels, isolation.
And by isolation, well, it also means talking in demeaning way about the family, like your father is lazy and just uneducated, and really such humiliating, demeaning phrases. And in such situations, the victim is isolated from the family. Because if you have this kind of communication, you don't want to invite anyone from your family to come to visit you if your partner is really so demeaning. And so finally they end up being just two of them together, the perpetrator and the victim. And let's keep in mind, this is social control. If a person has now contact with family and friends, then violation is escalating. And emotional violence, ignoring a husband who for a week has refused to talk to his wife. And also, and is always sort of underscoring this, that I'm not going to talk to you, that's meaningless. You're not worth speaking to. So we work with individuals and in groups. First of all, we expand the topic. We try to understand what violence is, not only in the stereotypical understanding of it. We speak about sexuality quite often. And also, it's very important to speak about personal responsibility, to make the perpetrator understand that he or she is violent, that it's a personal problem for them and they have to work on it. Because that's what the perpetrators often don't understand. and then the father and the child. It's very important to understand what kind of relationship the perpetrator had with the father, to understand what you have inherited, what you don't want to continue, and to speak with the perpetrator about how his children will remember him. And also alternatives to violence, because quite often violence is inherited in the family, and the person has to understand that there are alternatives to it. Then about the causes, to look for the causes why a person turned into a perpetrator. Why I am a perpetrator? Why am I violent? To find an answer to this question. And then really you have to look into the background, into the childhood of the person. And we also have to look at the consequences. Not only for those around him, but also for himself or for herself. What they are inflicting upon themselves. And sometimes this improves understanding. I have now tried to outline what this treatment, the therapy, deals with. As I said, expand the definition of the concept violence, which I just explained. We use different tools to create insight and reflection for the perpetrators, but I have no time to present all of these to you now. We also want to develop in the perpetrators a conviction that they are able to change. Sometimes it happens that you see some improvements in the people, but then they again fall back into violence. Even if they have sort of been able to refrain for it for some time, it proves that they would be able to do it in the long term. In all matters, it is important to form an alliance. The perpetrator should not be isolated. He or she should trust the therapist and see themselves both as being in one joint battle. And also the person should engage in in-depth self-analysis, and finally take responsibility for one's feelings and try to control them. To understand that this is a private matter, that this is not always linked to the environment, and also to understand that this is not only behavior that should be changed, that this all goes deeper. And also we have to or the perpetrator has to understand how to draw attention to one's behavior, understand how their brain works, the feelings, and what kind of behavior it all leads to. It is also important to develop communication skills. Quite often they are quite well-restrained persons, and it's important to find the right language to make them speak, and also to develop their empathy skill, their ability to imagine oneself in the place of the partner or of the children as well. Also, the person needs to develop their parenting skills. We are also offering this kind of training. And then the other partner is also invited to join. So we want to train them to speak normally, so that they will be able to speak to their children. It is also important that at the moment when the person has understood his or her responsibility, it is important to look ahead and to be able to, the person should be able to apologize to the partner and to the children. It is very important. And actually, it's very effective if people apologize. now coming back to sort of making the perpetrator assume responsibility. How to achieve this? First of all, we have to make them understand that this comes from the perpetrator's own feelings. And it's also important to look at oneself as if from a side, somehow to slow oneself down at the moment when you want to be violent. And also to make oneself understand that because of this behavior, the partners will only isolate. If the wife senses this violence, she will become even more detached. And to understand that there are other possible ways of responding, not only through violence. And it's important for them to understand that this is a personal problem. It's their own sort of feelings that are driving them into violence and not other persons. And of course, people resort to violence because it allows them to get or to achieve something that the perpetrator needs or wants. So the perpetrator, in a way, gains control over the situation. It's important for the perpetrator to tell themselves, I am violent because, not because you need it, but I'm violent because I need it. And so they have to do this work. Now, very briefly, what we have learned from research and studies. As I mentioned, it's important to have this alliance, and it's important for the client to understand that it's his or her own personal battle or personal burden. So I think I briefly outlined this. And a very simple way how to put it. It's important to think about the little frightened one, a child at home. Such a very simple example. It allows you to understand better. And we have to point this out to the perpetrator that people are not violent to people whom they love. And quite often then people start feeling ashamed. Thank you.